So I'm Connie May. I don't know if Shelby told you guys who I am, but I do natural landscaping. I managed Shooting Star Nursery for about 10 years. You probably know about Shooting Star if you know about native plants. And then I left there for a number of years, and now I'm doing natural landscaping. And I'm interested in rain gardens because they include native plants, and I love all things native plants. This program is not specific to native plants. I'm sorry, it's not specific to rain gardens because all native plants are good for rain gardens. I remember once going to a rain garden tour and seeing prickly pear cactus, which is very drought tolerant in a rain garden. That's because rain gardens generally go like this, kind of like a little bowl. And the part down here, plants that can take wetter soils need to be. At the top part, plants that are more drought tolerant need to be. So there are many native plants that will work in there. Not all of them, as Amy said, are wild and woolly. Some of them are, and people have the impression that native plants are really wild and they need to look that way. They absolutely do not. They can, just like any perennial garden, but you can use trees and shrubs in your rain garden and have a rain forest. You can use some very small, petite, lovely little natives that you wouldn't even know were natives because they don't look wild. So a lot of people most people actually who come to me for help with their landscapes are inspired to change their yards because they're worried about loss of habitat and they want to help promote biodiversity. And of course they're right, and we'll talk about that. But what really has inspired me, particularly recently, is how changing people's yards change their lives. It's really amazing. And just last night I had a fellow call me from here in Lexington. We did his yard last year, and he called and said, "Connie, I'm looking at a woodpecker. For the first time I have a woodpecker in my backyard." And I hear that over and over. It's just absolutely amazing how people get so inspired. And these two folks, his wife, she's retired and he works part-time. She said first thing in the morning he goes out and looks in his garden, and as soon as he gets home he takes off his jacket and he goes out and looks around in the yard. And they never went in their yards before because all it was grass. So truly it can inspire you to live your life in a different way. That's what inspires me. One of the things that inspires me. I'm going to use my verbiage here because I can get excited and talk too much, and I don't want to keep you here all day, so I want to be more succinct. Kentucky was once covered with woods, prairies, and wetlands, and home to an incredible diversity of life. The land that was once home to that wildlife is being bulldozed at an alarming rate for roads, subdivisions, and shopping malls. So, where are the birds, the butterflies, the lightning bugs? When did you last see a box turtle? We have some really beautiful parks and nature preserves in this country, but they're not nearly enough to ensure the survival of species. We have 40 million acres of lawn in the U.S. If we want birds and butterflies and other wildlife in our lives, we need to start opening up those lawns to wildlife, creating habitat. And we can very easily do that. Can you see how beautiful this is? I don't see it very well because it's light, but it's a beautiful garden right in Backyard Lexington off of Nicholasville Road. It's the backyard of Betty Hall and Harry Hall. And considering where it is, off of Nicholasville Road, it's home to an incredible variety of butterflies and birds. These are all from Betty's backyard. Recent research is clearly showing that backyard habitat is not only important for the survival of wildlife, it's important for the survival of us. The arguments are compelling. They point out the many ways that we depend on other species for our survival on this planet. For example, trees in the landscape in the neighborhoods absorb carbon and release oxygen so that we can breathe. Plants in rain gardens filter pollutants. Insects pollinate our crops. Birds and mammals keep the insects in check. So on and so on. We all learned it in school, I think, as the web of life. Do you remember that? Native plants are the foundation of the web of life. Without native plants and the diversity of wildlife that they support, again, we simply can't exist. The good news is that the same research is showing that as we begin to plant natives in urban areas, the wildlife begins to come back very quickly. Even endangered species come back. Betty Hall's garden in Lexington, Betty and Harry's garden in Lexington, is living proof. Betty is an avid gardener. She's 80, I think. She's been gardening for years, and she had a beautiful big perennial garden in her backyard. But you know Betty Hall. But she became interested in attracting butterflies and decided to take out all of her non-native plants in her really large garden, plant native plants and a few shrubs in her garden. She told me when I met her, I did not design Betty's garden. It was there when I met her. It had been there a few years. But she told me that almost immediately after they put in native plants, they started seeing more insects and more birds, more hummingbirds, more wildlife in their yard. Almost immediately. It was wonderful. Have any of you guys seen the article about Betty Hall recently in the Herald Leader? She's the lady, they call her the butterfly lady now. She's the one who is, she was raising butterflies indoors. So her garden absolutely has transformed her life. Betty recently did a spectacular thing for her, and for anybody. She spoke to 100 middle school kids. So that's something she wouldn't have ever done before. It's not the kind of person she is. She's kind of shy. So it's just amazing how her garden has transformed her life. I personally am deeply grateful to Harry and Betty for sharing their garden and their lives with me and with a lot of other people in a lot of different ways. These images are all from Betty's garden. There might be a couple of things like the bulldozer that I took or something, but these are Betty's images, and I know that she hopes and I hope that seeing these images will help to inspire you to want to put some of these beautiful things in your yard as well. So, what is a native plant? People ask me that. It's pretty easy, actually. A native plant is simply a plant that grew in a particular area, in this case in Kentucky. It grew in Kentucky before Europeans came here and started planting plants from Europe. So some of them, like black-eyed Susies, are already used in the landscape. They're common. We've seen them. Purple coneflowers are native. They're common. But there are lots and lots of wonderful, exotic, sometimes exotic-looking plants like this passion flower that's beautiful and easy to grow. But it's not commonly planted simply because it hasn't been available in the landscape. But they are now available. The important difference between native plants and non-native plants is that native plants co-evolved with the native insects and other wildlife, birds that live in Kentucky. Non-native plants do not provide habitat in the same way that native plants do. Does that mean that you have to take all of your native plants out of your garden to feel good about yourself? No. I would have a really hard time giving up my irises and my daffodils. I love them. Most of my yard is natives, but I do have a few favorites that I enjoy that aren't natives. But the important thing to remember is that the more natives that we have in our yards, the better off we all will be. We depend on this wildlife to make living on this planet possible for us. So if you have a yard this big, which I think if you live in this neighborhood you do not, but if you have a yard this big, you have a lot of opportunity. What I would tell a person to do in this yard is I would say, how much of the yard do you use? You can see back in the corner they have the playground for the kids. Probably want a bit of a front yard and that sort of thing. Define where you want your yard to be. How much of your lawn do you actually use? Look at your yard. No matter how big it is, look at it and see how much of your lawn you use, how much is meaningful, and get rid of the rest of it. There's a wonderful image of native plant roots, and it shows clearly grass roots grow at the same depth as the top. So if you're mowing your grass 4 inches, then the roots are 4 inches. If you put in a native plant, they can go 15, 20 feet literally into the ground and have lots of masses of roots. So they're breaking up soil so that the water can infiltrate. I used to think this because I would say, why would you put a rain garden there? Anything that comes off of that roof is just going to be filtered by the grass. No big deal, right? It seems to make sense. But this is so compacted by being mowed every week, and the roots are so shallow that what happens is when it rains and the water rushes off that big roof, it just sheets completely off. It's almost as if it was on pavement. It's not like you would think it would be. I was kind of shocked to learn that. So at any rate, what we would do, if we didn't want a rain garden, what we could do to help filter that water in a big yard like this, or in a small yard like yours, define what you want as lawn, and do something with the rest of it. In this area like this, you could just stop mowing. And what would happen is, in 5 years, 7 years, it would happen like this. You would have trees starting to come up. 15, 20 years, we'd be back to what Kentucky wants to be. You know, Wendell Berry has a poem that says, I think these hills want to speak tree. Kentucky was covered with forests. If you stop mowing, we will have trees here. Tree seedlings will come in. But of course, not all of us want to stop mowing or can stop mowing, but all of us have room for some native plants, and most of us have room for some trees and shrubs.